Mark, what do we know?
Well, we know there's a report in the Nikkei overseas overnight indicating that Apple is cutting a couple of production lines related to this budget 10R phone. And quite frankly, I'm a bit surprised that these reports aren't already built into the stock price. If you do a Google search on Nikkei iPhone order cuts, you'll see results ranging from, upwards of 4 or 5 years back. This is an annual story. I think it's a mix of what the publication is looking for, combined with adjustments that Apple makes after the initial, few opening weekends of new iPhone releases.
Walter, what's your reaction to this report? Does it raise an eyebrow?
I think just what Mark said, he profiled the fact that this has been going on for years. And actually, the company, to a certain extent, invited this. I mean, I think some of these things have been kind of ignored in recent years. There wasn't much of it even going into this quarter. And by the company talking about not reporting units going forward, they're going to allow stories like this to resonate more in the market because there's no data point that's going to follow when the company reports a unit number that may, contradict a lot of these, what I would call supply chain stories that tend to emerge before the quarter. So I think they haven't done themselves any service by saying they're not going to report units, because I think that actually helped to temper the impact that stories like this have had on the stock in some of the recent quarters.
I seem to remember over the years, many times talking about these reports about production when it comes to Apple. Any little bit of information, analysts and investors and reporters, we fixate on it. Mark, what might this say about the popularity of that cheaper iPhone in particular, which is kind of a new strategy for Apple?
Right. It's possible this could be yet another swing and miss on the low end of the market. Remember, Apple's tried this before with the iPhone SE, discontinued after about 2.5 years. Earlier this year, they've tried this with the iPhone 5C, discontinued after 2 years as well. I would not be surprised if the iPhone XR is discontinued after 2 or 3 years or so, once they're able to get the functionality that they're bringing down in cost throughout the rest of the line at that lower price. But again, this is all about bringing these devices out at lower prices, and eventually things will meet in the middle, and this phone won't be necessary.
So, Walter, then what is your outlook for this holiday quarter?
Well, the flip side of Mark's argument is also that the XS and the XS Max are actually selling very well. And last year, when there was this belief that maybe the iPhone X crossing through $1,000 was going to limit some of the attractiveness of it, it actually was a great phone that sold in each of the quarters going forward. So it could be that the outlook ends up being positive, because this is a reflection that customers continue to gravitate to the higher priced phone. So even though you may not see unit growth, well, you're not going to see anything because the company doesn't report it anymore, you'll see some revenue growth still, just from the fact that they're getting their existing very loyal customer base to pay them more and more each year for their products.
We never quite know what the mix of the iPhones is. It's always anyone's guess, and we sort of try to deduce that based on the average selling price of the iPhone. Mark, what do we believe the mix is at this point? Do we have any indication of which phone consumers are really springing for?
I mean, last year the price points were exactly the same pretty much as they were this year, except for that additional high-end model. And like you said, the ASPs give us some color there. And Apple's comments that the iPhone X was the best-selling iPhone every week, that combination lets us know, and Walter might be able to attest to this, or if this is right, that the mix is skewed towards probably the XS and XS Max at this point, especially also because those two phones had much more runway so far in the quarter than the XR.
Curious, Walter, how is your job going to change now that Apple is not going to be reporting these unit sales? What kinds of information are you going to be looking for? How are you going to draw your conclusions?
Well, it's actually better for us because we've always approached this from the demand side. I've focused on the wireless operators. What are they saying about their upgrade rates? The life cycle of a phone has been extending ever since the iPhone 6. The Apple sold, 231 million phones several years ago. They still haven't reached that level. So the demand side analysis actually, I think, benefits. It's obviously for some of my peers who rely on the supply side and getting some of the data points out of confirmation of that later on. It might be a little bit more challenging. It'll be more volatile for them because there's not as much, I think, valid data points to check where where some of that stuff's coming from.
Mark, I do want to get your thoughts on, the developments in the trade war we're hearing now. Even more compelling words from the Chinese side. President Xi hitting back at some of the things that President Trump has said. What will all of this mean for Apple?
It really just depends on how long these tariffs, go on for, right? I mean, if you're looking at the political climate in the United States right now, it's very likely that the tariffs, if they come into place soon, will be around for either 2 more years or 6 more years. If you think about how long it would take a company that produces as many devices on an annual basis as Apple to move their supply chain out of China to countries perhaps like Malaysia and Vietnam that wouldn't be right in the middle of this trade war, that could take 2 or 3 years in itself. So I think Apple's going to take a wait-and-see approach. They're going to see what happens with the tariffs if they're implemented. They're going to wait out what the political climate will be in the United States. And while they're waiting, they're clearly doing some quiet measures against this. If you look at the price raises that they've done recently on some of their products, those are products specific to ones that are going to be affected by the tariffs. The Apple Pencil, one of the products, a $30 increase. The Mac Mini, another one of the products, a $300 increase. The MacBook Air, a $200 increase. The leather cases that they're selling for their products to cover the new iPads, those got significant price increases comparatively as well. So while they're waiting out the bigger picture, they're making small changes to avoid any short-term problems as well on their revenues and profits.
And some of those are fairly significant price increases, Walter. I mean, Apple obviously has a supply chain entrenched in China. The Chinese market is a huge part of Apple earnings. How concerned are you about this trade situation?
I mean, there's always a concern, but there's been a lot of noise. This impacts a lot of the companies that we cover, and if there's any company that has some level of pricing power in the market to pass that along to the customers and it gets digested well, it's obviously Apple, right? They've done this and gotten higher margins. Now you're talking about a company that has ridiculously high gross margins for a consumer electric product. They're going into a quarter that they're facing some currency headwinds, still guiding for strong margins. Again, it's something you have to always worry about and keep your eyes on. But again, it's in Apple's case, there's maybe a little less worry given their ability to increase price.